Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Amelia Bloomer. These women were pioneers of women's fashion reform during the late 19th century. In 1848, they, along with many other women, attended the Women's Right Convention at Seneca Falls. At the convention, prominent leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton called for women to have more rights in government. Women activists shared many goals such as voting rights, marriage law reform, higher education for women, and abolishing slavery. As the Civil War came to an end, the Gilded Age was born. The Gilded Age refers to a brief time in American history after the Civil War Restoration era. During this time, the United States experienced a population and economic boom, leading to the creation of an incredibly wealthy upper class. The era only lasted a few short years from 1877 to 1893, before the market crash of 1893 brought a severe depression to the entire country. Among the many reform movements of the 19th century was a movement to reform women's style of dress. The fashionable long skirts made with yards of heavy material, tight corsets which were used to create an hourglass shape, and high-heeled shoes were all blamed for poor health in women. Men did not want this change to occur because they felt as if women were speaking out against them.
Well, men wanted to keep women constrained. The constraints of the dress, the corset, the styles was as a reaction to men's feeling threatened.
Well, dress reform in a way represented an opportunity for women to fight for equality, which had begun in the mid-19th century with Seneca Falls in upstate New York. Just like they were fighting for political equality, social equality was part of it too. And having control over the clothes that they wore represented, in a sense, a stretch for their independence.
They would look to fashion because that was what the men saw and how people would treat them, and it would, whether it was class, status, power, any of these things, fashion was the venue in which they could push that envelope.
In the 1850s, the first wave of dress reform movement began among members of the women's suffrage movement. Some of these women adopted a costume that came to be known as the bloomer or Turkish costume. It consisted of a short, loosely draped dress over very loose pantaloons. The use of the dress was not very widespread and eventually died out, as even the reformers returned to their old style of dressing.
In the spring of 1851, while spending many hours at work in the garden, I became so thoroughly disgusted with the long skirt that the dissatisfaction and the growth of years suddenly ripened into the decision that this shackle should no longer be endured. The resolution was at once put into practice. Turkish trousers to the ankle with a skirt reaching some 4 inches below the knee was substituted for the heavy, untidy, exasperating old garment. I wore the short dress and trousers for many years, my husband being at all times and in all places my staunch supporter. My father gave the dress his full approval, and I was also blessed by the tonic of Mrs. Stanton's inspiring words. The question is no longer, rags, how do you look? But women, how do you feel? All hail to the day when we shall have a reasonable and beautiful dress that shall encourage exercise on the road and in the field, that shall leave us the free use of our limbs, that shall help and not hinder our perfect development.
Bloomers were originally invented by Elizabeth Smith Miller, but were popularized by Amelia Bloomer, hence the name. They were intended to preserve Victorian decency while being less of a hindrance to women's activities than the long full skirts of the period. While they were successful in making women's clothing more comfortable to wear, they were widely ridiculed in the press and failed to become commonly accepted. It later returned as a women's athletic costume in the 1890s and early 1900s. The bloomer was soon replaced by the crinoline, a hoop skirt that was inspired by the open cage or frame style of the 16th and 17th century. This fabric made its first appearance in fashion in the 1830s when it was used in women's petticoats to support the shape and growing length of the early Victorian dress. The crinoline was worn by women of every social class. The new fashion statement began to appear in magazines and newspapers everywhere, and was often affordable since it was highly mass-produced. Just like the bloomer, the crinoline became the subject of much ridicule and satire. Dress reformers did not like it either. They seized upon the cage aspect of the crinoline and claimed that it effectively imprisoned women. The crinoline was extremely difficult to move around in and caused problems for everyday actions such as getting through doors, moving in and out of carriages, and even sitting down. By 1860, the crinoline had grown to its maximum dimensions. The large dome-shaped skirts began to fall out of fashion. It was soon replaced by the crinolet. This cage structure was still attached around the waist and extended down to the ground, but only extended down the back of the wearer's legs. The crinolet itself was quickly superseded by the bustle, which was sufficient for supporting the drapery and train at the back of the skirt. Dress reform again found a voice in the 1870s and 80s with activists such as Frances Willard. Willard spoke out against the physical and moral damage done by wearing fashionable corsets, heavy skirts, and evening gowns that showed off the bust and arms. As the bustle grew popular in women's fashion in the late 19th century, women activists turned their attention to undergarment reform. The creation of the emancipation bodice relieved women of having to wear tight-fitting corsets. The emancipation bodice was a tight sleeveless vest, buttoning up in the front with rows of buttons along the bottom to which could be attached to petticoats and skirt. However, tight lacing still remained as an issue. In 1881, the Rational Dress Society was formed. It protested against any fashion and dress that deformed the figure, such as tight corsets, high-heeled shoes, and heavy skirts. Many doctors and journalists sided with women reformists who often wrote articles condemning the vanity and foolishness of women who would sacrifice their health for fashion. Women fashion reformists did not need to fret about the issue of corsets and tight lacing for long. All this changed in the early 20th century when the world of fashion circled back to the styles reminiscent of the empire silhouette. An empire silhouette is created by a woman wearing a high-waisted dress gathered near or just under the bust with a long loose skirt which skims the body. Originally, this was most popular during the early 19th century. With the decline of the bustle, sleeves began to increase in size, and the 1830s silhouette of an hourglass shape became popular again. The fashionable silhouette of the early 1900s was that of a mature woman with full low chest and curvy hips. In 1897, the silhouette slimmed and elongated by a considerable amount. Blouses and dresses were full in front and puffed into a pigeon breast shape of the early 20th century that looked over the narrow waist, which sloped from the back to front and was often accented with a sash or belt. Necklines were supported by very high collarbones. Skirts brushed to the floor, often with a train, even for day dresses in mid-decade. By the end of the decade, the most fashionable skirts cleared the floor and approached the ankle. The overall silhouette narrowed and straightened, beginning a trend that would continue into the years leading up to the Great War. This decade marked the full flowering of Parisian haute couture as the arbiter of styles and silhouettes for women of all classes. Paul Poiret was one of the leaders in this movement. He replaced the corset with the hobble skirt, thereby liberating women from the figure-distorting silhouettes that had existed in one form or another since the Renaissance.
It was in the name of liberty that I proclaimed the fall of the corset and the adoption of the brassiere, which since then has won the day. Yes, I freed the bust, but I shackled the legs.
Gabrielle Coco Chanel was a pioneering French fashion designer whose menswear-inspired fashions and pursuit of expensive simplicity made her an important figure in 20th century fashion. She was the founder of the famous fashion brand Chanel.
Du mon pauvre Coco, Coco mon chien que j'adore.
Pour Coco.
Trocadéro, il est loin s'il courant. Coco, et Coco, et Coco.
Des robes sans corset, des chapeaux sans plumes. Ça c'est Coco.
Toutes les femmes te regardent.
Toutes les femmes te regardent toi.